So this next mixing hack is going to bounce off of the previous one, which involved using audio effect racks to create parallel processing chains. And what we're going to be doing here is using parallel process chains with the audio effect racks, but I'm going to show you a way to split the frequencies of your sound into different bands. And the cool thing about this is it will allow you to process each band differently. So for example, I could have maybe more or less reverb on the high frequencies in the sound, maybe more or less distortion on the low frequencies of the sound. So we get this sort of frequency dependent processing that we kind of open up for ourselves if we use this technique. Now there are a lot of great plugins out there, like here's an example of one. I threw a FabFilter Saturn on this drum loop, and the Saturn is a distortion effect, and the cool thing about the Saturn is that I can click on this big red field up here in the top half window of the plugin, and you can see I've got this little plus button that pops up, and if I click that, I can do that several times here, and I can create different frequency bands. Here's my low band now. I've created a mid band and a high band. Each one can be distorted differently. We can have different settings, different levels of gain or distortion on each one. Each one can actually be EQ'd differently. There's a whole lot of different things we can open up for ourselves by splitting the bands like this and processing each one differently. Now unfortunately not every plugin, not every effect is going to give you that functionality, but there is a way that we can kind of work around that limitation. So again, going back to our audio effect rack, let's just go to a blank audio effect rack from the audio effects folder in the categories. We're going to drag and drop it onto this drums track. And let's just play the drums back really quick so you can hear what we're working with. Cool. So let's open up the chain view over here. And where it says drop audio effects here, what we're going to do is grab an instance of Ableton Live's multiband dynamics effect. So just the default. We'll drag and drop it right here where it says drop audio effects here. And without launching into a whole long-winded explanation about what multiband dynamics is, it's essentially a multiband compressor and expander, and it allows you to apply dynamic controls or control the dynamics of a high band of frequencies, a mid band of frequencies, and a low band of frequencies. The high band is defined by anything above this frequency up here, 2.5 kilohertz. The low frequency is defined by anything below this frequency down here, which is set to 120 hertz. And then the mid band is essentially anything in between those two frequencies. And this default setting gives us a pretty good starting point for where to split out frequencies. Now we can of course use this to just dynamic process, that is compress or expand any of the three bands of frequencies here, but we can also use this in another way to just solo or just isolate certain bands for further processing. So what I'm going to do here is duplicate this chain twice. So we'll click on it, press Command or Control D, and we've duplicated. So now we have, and I'm going to turn this down because if I play it back it's going to be pretty loud, but we now have three copies of this signal that are identical that are just all playing back. So we don't necessarily want to hear three identical copies just blasting back in our ears. So what we want to do is go to each one of these different chains that each has its own instance of multiband dynamics in it, and we just want to solo these different frequency bands. So we'll go to this first one and let's rename this highs, for example, and we will solo the high band. Just click the S button there. Let's go to the middle chain and let's call this mids, and we'll solo the middle band of frequencies. And then on the third one, you guessed it, we're going to name it lows, and we will solo the low end. So now if we play this back, we're going to hear essentially the same signal, but it's been split into three different frequency bands. Let's bypass. Turn it back on. So you can see it's more or less identical. So the benefit here is not necessarily to go in and just compress or expand the different chains independently, although we very well could, but really we're just using the multiband dynamic effect to split the frequencies out. And in fact, what I'm going to do is double click on the top of each one of these multiband dynamics just to kind of get them out of the way, because I'm not even really going to use it after this point. I'm just soloing a band on each one of these three chains. But the cool thing is we can, for example, take, I don't know, let's say a saturator. Let's just put it on the lows band. Now you want to make sure that the effect shows up after the actual multiband dynamics. So what we have here is this lows chain. The multiband dynamics is isolating the low frequencies on that chain, and now only the low frequencies will be affected by the saturator. On the other side of the coin, if I took the saturator and I moved it outside the rack, what's going to happen? Well, all three of our chains, I want to leave that soloed, all three of our chains are passing through the saturator, so it would essentially be the same as us having no effect here, splitting frequencies, and just hearing the saturator across the whole drum loop. So that's why it's very important to drag and drop it onto the right chain. It's also very important to make sure that that effect is showing up after the instance of multiband dynamics. Because the low band has been soloed here and isolated, everything below 120 Hertz essentially is the only thing getting affected by this saturator. So if we play it back, we can start to go over to the saturator. Let's, again, shrink down multiband dynamics. I'm just going to double click it to get it out of the way. I'm just going to focus on saturator. If I turn up the drive, we're just distorting that kick in the drum loop. Maybe we'll take another instance of saturator, drop it on the highs chain. And on the highs chain, let's maybe use a different saturator curve. And we can just brighten up only the high frequencies without affecting the lows at all. And I'm noticing the highs are a little loud now, so we'll just turn them down from here using the chain volume. We could also, of course, use the output gain on the saturator itself. And we're only using saturation right now, but you can use this with reverb, you could use this with delay, with chorus, with flangers, with all kinds of different effects to process only certain frequency bands in a sound and leave either other ones unaffected or process other ones in a completely different way. So this is a quick and easy technique to split frequencies. You can essentially take any effect and make it a multi-band processing effect if you want to, using this rack. One last thing I'll leave you with, let's just clear the rack out of any effects besides the multi-band dynamics. But what we could do here is we could take this now and save this effect rack, maybe I'll call it frequency splitter, and save the effect rack, save it into my user library here, and now I have an audio effect rack I can simply drag in and then just start to multiband process any sound in my mix with any effect that I want to. It can be stock Ableton effects, it can be plugins, whatever you want. So use this again to split out frequencies for multiband processing. Take advantage of it in your mix downs. Have fun with this one. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.